So today I'm chatting with Keith Whittington, who's the David Boies Professor of Law at Yale Law School. And we're talking about his book written in 2007 called Political Foundations of Judicial Supremacy. And even though the book is amazingly 18 years old, I think it has enormous insight into our current moment about how to understand and think about President Trump's very ambitious and aggressive presidency, about how to think about the relationship between the presidency and the Supreme Court and maybe the lower courts, and about an issue that is right on the surface these days, which is, are the courts supreme? Do they have judicial supremacy? And we'll talk about what that means. Or does the executive branch have an independent interpretive role in defining the Constitution? So, Keith, I just want to emphasize that in studying the book this year, I've just been just amazed at how potentially relevant it is to our moment. So I wanted to hear from you what you thought about it, since the book is 18 years old. So why don't you just tell us about the book and just give us an overview of the book, and then we'll jump in.
Yeah, time marches on. The the book is old at this point, but as you say, I think it does feel fairly relevant to our moment right now, and that is sort of what I would have hoped for the book, that it tries to make sense of patterns in American history that I don't think are merely confined to the past, but things that are persistent features of the American constitutional order that we should expect to continue to be persistent into the future. And as a consequence, some patterns we've seen in the past should recur. And I think we're encountering one of those now where some things are recurring. So, what the book is generally concerned with is the relationship between presidents and the U.S. Supreme Court, in particular, across American history, and variations in how much presidents attempt to seize leadership away from the U.S. Supreme Court in understanding what the Constitution means and defining what our constitutional principles and values are. And when presidents are instead much more deferential to the court and try to push constitutional questions into the court system for their resolution inside the judiciary. And as part of that, I think presidents have often found themselves in situations where they want to build up judicial authority in order to help courts resolve those questions and try to emphasize these are purely legal questions or technical questions. They're not questions that politicians have to grapple with, or the presidents ought to be held responsible for, but instead questions that courts can take off the plate of politicians. And most politicians prefer to be in that situation. And as a consequence, the court has assumed a very large role in the American constitutional order precisely because politicians, through most of American history, prefer it that way.
But they don't always. And one of the things you said, I think will strike readers as strange. You said something like, presidents try to wrench from courts control over constitutional meaning, something like that.
Yeah.
And the way lawyers think about this most of the time, and you're a political scientist who teaches in a law school, and I think that the political science perspective here is, you know, penetrating compared to the normal lawyers take. But I just want people to understand, how can that be possible? We have this idea that the court that is determines the domain of constitutional meaning. So what do you mean by presidents, I'm paraphrasing what you said, wrenching away control or the agenda of constitutional meaning?
Yeah, and if I didn't use wrenching, I probably should have. It's a good term for
That was
this.
my word, my word.
um, but so yeah, part of the interest in the book in the first place, it sort of comes from two different directions, both sort of empirical questions about how American constitutionalism works, some of which was a background interest of mine, and some of which was captured in an earlier book. So, in an earlier book, Constitutional Construction, I argued that political actors play an important role in interpreting what the Constitution means and trying to develop a set of constitutional practices that supplement constitutional law in various ways. And all across American history, we can see examples of politicians, presidents, members of Congress, members of state governments grappling with the meaning of the Constitution in various sorts of contexts and putting in place sort of settlements that stick for some significant period of time. So
Unpack for the more general listener
yeah.
what a settlement that sticks means.
So so one way of thinking about this, right, is we imagine in constitutional law context usually that there are right or wrong answers to what the Constitution means as a matter of interpretation. And once we identify what the right answer is, that's the new rule, and will stay with us for as long as that constitutional text is in place. Unless we somehow decide later that we just got it wrong, in which case the court overturns its precedent and says, oh, we made a mistake here. We're going to understand the rule to be different moving forward. Part of what I argue in this constitution construction framework is that there are parts of the Constitution that are fairly indeterminate, that they don't have those kind of clear right and wrong answers. Courts, and moreover, there's some of those issues are specifically entrusted to political branches to resolve. Some of them are just indeterminate, and various branches of government or actors might engage with them. And in some cases, we may find situations in which, from a sort of British constitutional perspective, for example, we might think these are constitutional questions, but the Constitution actually doesn't say much of anything about them. And so they leave sort of important issues about what rights people have, for example, or how power should be exercised, or who makes decisions, sort of completely unresolved, such that we have to figure it out for ourselves. Okay, what do we do under those circumstances? So we have sort of space of judgment and discretion within the constitutional order. And one thing that politicians have frequently done is then work out, I characterize them as settlements or constructions, that this is a practical way in which we're going to move forward with how we think the Constitution is going to operate. And and part of what's, I think, significant about those is that those are not just purely transitory, but instead they are taken as a kind of political precedent that sticks around for some extended period of time. And for various reasons, right? So it might just think it's purely functional. This works reasonably well, so we're just going to keep doing it. It might be that people are persuaded this actually meets our highest values, and so they think it's normatively important that we continue to do it. You can imagine sort of sets of interest and policies that get organized around it, so it continues over time. But those settlements may not be permanent, and precisely in part because they're not about right and wrong answers about what the Constitution means, but instead they're fairly durable, but nonetheless they are somewhat contingent ways in which we've worked out these indeterminacies. So I
Okay.
think, for example, take a relatively straightforward kind of example of this is the way in which our electoral college works in terms of the discretion exercised by presidential electors. We almost immediately moved to a system in which presidential electors pledge themselves to vote for particular candidates and understand themselves as not exercising discretion in the moment of casting ballots as to who they're going to vote for. They've already decided who they're going to vote for, and we elect them on the assumption that we know who they're going to vote for. So they become a mere mechanical feature of the process rather than a discretionary part of the process as they were sort of originally envisioned. This is consistent with the constitutional text, but it could have played out differently in terms of what our expectations are. But there's a strong set of norms and practices that have built up around the Electoral College that assumes electors should not be exercising independent judgment as they exercise that power. And that's as deeply entrenched in our understanding of how the constitutional system works as practically anything else. But it is one of these kinds of political settlements. It's not required by the constitutional text. It's not right as a matter of constitutional law, but it is a practical political construction of how our constitutional system operates.
So I want to shift this to something closer to Trump
Yeah,
because one of the striking themes of the judicial supremacy book is that the presidents who are most aggressive in challenging the court on what constitutional meaning should be and bringing us to what I would call a new equilibrium in constitutional meaning. You didn't use that phrase.
yeah.
These are our greatest presidents, or who are presidents who are widely viewed as our greatest presidents. People with names like Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, whom I think Roosevelt is the most
Yeah,
directly, closely related president to what Trump is doing. And these were presidents who, and I think I want to ask you to talk about the Roosevelt example, because these were presidents who had their own vision of the Constitution. They thought the court was, I'm paraphrasing, you can correct me how
yeah,
I'm wrong. They thought the court was out of tune with the way the Constitution should be read at that time, given the needs of the country. And they basically made a play through some sometimes hardball tactics to change constitutional meaning and persuade the courts to adopt a certain meaning of the Constitution, including various types of threats to the courts trying to
yeah.
change the court. So, just can you just comment on this? These are our greatest presidents, and what is it about? I mean, is there a connection? Maybe they don't have to be seen as great. A couple of these are acting in times of dire emergency.
Right.
So maybe that's part of it. But what is it between why were those extraordinary presidents engaged in this practice? Is there a relationship?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so we should probably characterize great in this context in sort of descriptive terms
Yeah,
rather
I
than
mean that
in
descriptively, not
right,
normatively. I
rather than
mean
normative
people.
terms, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
of
right.
course, great is complicated because it implies a kind of normativity,
We can
but I
even
think it's
strike. We can even strike great if you want. We'll just say these are highly esteemed by most people presidents.
yeah.
But
No, I
not
just want
everybody
to
agrees.
yeah, no, I'm not disagreeing. I just want to clarify. I think
I agree.
for
Yep.
listeners that by great we just mean extremely accomplished presidents that we think did very consequential things within our political and constitutional order.
Successfully. And you can argue about Jackson, but I think even there, that kind of brought the country to most people think a better place. I mean, certainly Lincoln, Jefferson, I think FDR is a fair example of that. So anyway, keep going.
Yeah. So sort of two things. So one is that, with the Constitution Construction book, partially I was interested in sort of how politicians settle constitutional meaning, but it raised questions about, well, if this is a feature of the constitutional order, why do we get so much judicial review in constitutional law, and why are courts so prominent in our constitutional system? And the judicial supremacy book in part was trying to explain why I think empirically that dynamic sort of emerges. But the other sort of background interest I had was in departmentalism as a sort of theory of constitutional interpretation and constitutional practice, in part because my first introduction to American constitutional thought was not reading Supreme Court opinions, but reading Jeffersonians and Jeffersonian politicians and how they thought about the Constitution. And departmentalism was front and center in their thinking.
Can
So
you
part of
just
this book was concerned with trying to play out when does departmentalism emerge, and why is it not more prominent than it is across
can you
American history?
explain just briefly what departmentalism is, and maybe this is the point to contrast it with judicial supremacy?
Yeah, exactly. So the idea of departmentalism is one that the Jeffersonians first sort of articulate fairly clearly, and it becomes sort of an article of faith among Jeffersonian politicians. But then it has periods of resurgence where later presidents, and it's all the great presidents you just cited, refer back to Jefferson and other examples as precedents for how they ought to think about their own powers and how they ought to exercise it. And the core feature of departmentalism is a claim that each branch of government, or in this older language, department of government, they're primarily focused on the presidency, but they also think it's true of Congress, for example. When it's exercising its own responsibilities, its own duties, has an independent and equal authority to interpret the meaning of the Constitution as it's relevant for performing their own duties. So when the president is making decisions about how to exercise the pardon power or how to exercise the veto power, when Congress is making decisions about what bills to pass into statutes, they may take what the Supreme Court says as persuasive or not, but they have an independent responsibility to make up their own minds about what they think the Constitution is, whether or not it's consistent with what the Supreme Court has said that might mean, and act accordingly in performing those duties. By contrast, the idea of judicial supremacy that unsurprisingly the judges are the most frequently expressing, is a view that judges have a primacy in defining what the meaning of the Constitution is. Other branches of government should be deferential to that understanding of what the meaning of the Constitution is. And when other branches are conducting their duties, they should do it in a way that is consistent and compatible with what the court has said. And here it's worth distinguishing a little bit, although it's a murky sort of distinction in some ways. But we should distinguish a little between, I think, sort of the idea of judicial supremacy from just pure judicial review as such. And so part of what and Lincoln was probably most explicit about this, where Lincoln, as a Senate candidate in the Lincoln Douglas debates, is extremely critical of Dred Scott, for example. And he's sort of accused then of being a kind of anarchist for criticizing the courts and how dare you question whether or not the courts are authoritative in resolving these kinds of constitutional questions. And Lincoln's response is to say, well, look, we have a responsibility as a government official, for example, as a president of the United States, to recognize the Supreme Court settles cases for parties in front of them. And so for Dred Scott, in that particular case, a case about whether or not Dred Scott, who was enslaved, was free as a consequence of traveling through Northern Territory where slavery was not legal. And the court says he's not, and so he remains a slave. And Lincoln says, look, we're all obliged to respect the court's authority to resolve that particular case, and Dred Scott will remain a slave. There's nothing we can do as government officials to alter that. But that doesn't mean we should take the logic of what the court said and extend it to other circumstances. As Lincoln characterizes it, the political rule, that is to say, what the court said in its opinions to explain the logic of how they came to the conclusion about the parties in front of them, shouldn't necessarily be adopted and carried forward by other government officials. And so a president could quite reasonably say, well, look, I can't do anything about Dred Scott, but when I encounter other kinds of contexts that are implicated by the logic of what the court said there, do I have to follow that or do I not? And the departmentalist view is you don't have to follow that. The judicial supremacist view is no, you do, because that's the correct understanding of the Constitution, and you are obliged to follow the court's understanding of what that is, even if you think the court happens to have gotten it wrong in those cases. And as I said, frequently presidents sort of like that view. It's helpful for them politically to be able to say, "Oh, sorry, my hands are tied. I'd really like to do something different, but the court has spoken, and what can you do?" And if you don't like it, take it up with the unelected judges. But on occasion, they in fact have a lot of political incentives to push back, and Lincoln's one of those who is situated to want to push back and say it's that they have a desire to take control of how we think about the Constitution and insist that their own reading is the correct one, and they don't just have to listen to judges and defer to judges, but can aggressively advance their own understanding.
Okay, before I want to move to Trump, but I want to just ask you to briefly, just
Yeah,
as thumbnail away as you can, to talk about FDR as, but your name for these is for presidents who are aggressive department. This is again my paraphrase. You correct me if I'm wrong. Aggressive departmentalists who seek to change constitutional meaning. Um, you call them reconstructive presidents, and I see FDR as maybe the paradigmatic example.
yeah.
And so, could you just briefly run through how he was reconstructive and how he was departmentalist, so we can get a concrete flavor, and then we'll see how Trump stacks up.
Yeah, so I borrow the concept of reconstructive presidents from Yale political scientist Stephen Skronig. Skronig argues that that we can divide up American history into extended periods in which there are a set of sort of fairly coherent and relatively stable and settled combinations of interests and values and principles and partisan and public policies that he characterizes as a political regime. And those get fixed in place often for a generation or two, and then they seem less effective. People are less tied to them. People start questioning them. They don't work as well in sort of changing circumstances. And eventually you get a political leader who arises who says, okay, we got to throw off a lot of assumptions about how we've been running the government and running society for the last 40, 50 years, and do something different moving forward. And those, when they're successful, he characterizes them as these reconstructive presidents. They remake the political landscape. They restructure our political coalitions. They articulate new visions about what kinds of ideals and aspirations ought to be guiding us moving forward. They offer a new set of public policies that make dramatic breaks from the past about how we've organized ourselves in the past. And I borrow that in part to say, and there are constitutional implications of those kinds of political and policy changes, that those kinds of arguments about we need to redesign our policy frameworks in order to move forward around a new set of values are often accompanied by a set of constitutional arguments as well about what kinds of powers do we have, what kinds of rights do people have, what kinds of constitutional values should we aspire to, that help sell that idea and also help connect those policy decisions to a larger constitutional framework. And those will sometimes, maybe frequently, lead those presidents into some conflict with established constitutional law that's been developed out over the last few decades leading up to them, in which they sort of wind up specifying some kinds of constitutional rules that may not be terribly compatible with these new ideas. One way of thinking about this that may be more familiar to some is and it echoes these kinds of arguments, is Thomas Kuhn's idea of scientific revolutions, where these Kuhnian notions that there are paradigms that shape what he characterizes as normal science. Most of the time, we don't question some fundamentals about sort of our understandings of how the universe works. We're just trying to work out the details given those fundamentals. And every once in a while, we radically transform how we're thinking about things. And so we work for a long time with Newtonian physics, and it gives us lots of clear answers, and we can work out the details of what the logic is of Newtonian physics. And then Einstein comes along and everything gets significantly reshuffled. And then we're starting to try to think through the logic of, okay, what do we learn from Einstein and people who are thinking about physics from a very different way. And we can think about politics working in similar kinds of ways. And so FDR and the New Deal, I think you're right, is a paradigmatic example of that, where FDR comes along and the Democratic coalition gets restructured to really, in the midst of the crisis of the Depression, to say, look, the way in which we've been doing things for the last 50 years or more isn't going to work so well going forward. We need to rethink our policies in dramatic ways. We need to rethink what the purpose and value of government is in significant ways. And that came with constitutional implications as well. And in FDR's case, led to some significant conflicts with the US Supreme Court as it was trying to enforce inherited constitutional rules. They were trying to do normal science in the midst of a revolution. And so they're doing normal science, applying traditional constitutional rules, I think, is the best interpretation of what the court was up to at the time. They're mostly applying the traditional constitutional rules to this very different situation. And FDR is pushing aggressively back against that and saying those rules shouldn't apply anymore. We need to reconceptualize what our constitutional law ought to be in order to be more accommodating to the kind of New Deal regime that I'm now in the midst of constructing. And that led Roosevelt to one, quote Jefferson and Lincoln and Jackson in order to publicly claim this kind of authority to push back on the court and to offer his own interpretations. It led him ultimately to propose the court packing plan to change the composition of the court in order to create a court that was more compatible and accommodating to what he was trying to do. And it led him to threaten the court in various ways during his first term of office, including ultimately preparing a speech they didn't wind up having to deliver, in which he was going to announce he was going to defy the court and refuse to comply with a court's judgment because he thought it would sink the country into an economic crisis that he thought he had a higher obligation to prevent. So in FDR's case, the conflict between the court trying to do normal constitutional law and Roosevelt trying to construct his new vision about how American government ought to work led to sort of severe conflicts between the court and the president in ways that were relatively unusual. You didn't see that severe of a conflict in some of these earlier reconstructive phases.
Okay, great. So let's move to Trump. Um, I just think the way you just described Roosevelt's term as first term as a or presidency as a reconstructive presidency, there's some obvious non-parallels, but there's some obvious parallels with Donald Trump. So I guess the question is Trump a reconstructive president? Does he have ambitions? Is that to be a reconstructive president? Should we, in this term, should we see the first 8 months of his second term with as one with reconstructive ambitions?
I think it's plausible. I think it's not yet entirely clear. So one of the things that makes Trump unusual from this kind of historical perspective is that most of these examples of presidents who are reconstructive actors in this way are also presidents who are making a partisan change from the past. And I think it's sensible to say we basically have been living in a political era shaped in important ways by Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party. The sort of vision about how government ought to work and what we ought to be doing, and the kind of basic policies and approaches to how we ought to be thinking is one in which Ronald Reagan sort of set the terms of debate in important ways. And you might think then if there's going to be a reconstructive president emerging, resisting that order and trying to topple it, they ought to come out of the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party. Well, one answer, of course, is well, the way he did come out of the Democratic Party, they just wound up capturing the Republican
Took
Party in the
over the Republican
process.
Party, exactly.
And so, and that's also a feature of these kind of when regimes, these political regimes are nearing the end, you do get a lot of sort of shifting around between the parties. It's not entirely clear who's who. You get sort of not only reshaping the coalitions, but also as the ideological commitments are breaking down, you get less clarity about sort of who's on what side of what party lines because all that's being reconfigured in important ways. So Trump is unusual in that regard, and he's also, I think, um, a little unusual because it's not entirely clear what the substantive agenda is. And so one thing that's presses against the court to some degree and presses on a lot of constitutional issues associated with the Trump administration is he's willing to aggressively use presidential power. And that bumps up against statutes and some constitutional law and the like. Um, but it's not as clear sort of what the bigger substantive vision is about the nature of society moving forward. And there's lots of competing factions inside and around the Trump administration sort of scrambling to try to identify what it might look like. And we saw that with FDR as well to a significant degree. FDR is all over the place, his administration's all over the place. There's lots of factions fighting internally about trying to capture the New Deal coalition and try to direct where it's going to go in the future. And so I think the Trump administration is a lot like the FDR New Deal moment in that sense as well, in that it's not yet clear. With FDR, if you looked at his first term as opposed to looking at his second or third term, it's a very different presidency, different set of policies, different kinds of ideas being advanced. And the coalition is kind of stable and electorally. But sort of what it means coming out of the New Deal, I think you'd have a very different view of that if you were just focused on his first term of office as opposed to the end of his second term of office, for example. So likewise with Trump, we're sort of still in the midst of it. And we will have a clearer view of it, not only at the end of his presidency, but also sort of what happens after his presidency.
I actually think that's a very important point. As discombobulating as things have seemed in the last 8 months, it's still very early. We haven't had a single Supreme Court decision on the merits yet of an executive power question, for example.
We have a
Just
long way to go still with the Trump
Yeah, we have a
presidency.
long way to go. And but just in terms of kind of the ambition of the executive power agenda, which might just be executive power for executive power's sake, or it might
Yeah,
be some vision of vertical authority within the executive, maybe driving all of this. I mean,
right.
it seems like an ambition to kind of change constitutional meaning if you look at the executive orders and if you take them seriously as legal documents. And some of the arguments they've made that they are making a play to rethink some basic constitutional understandings. Is that fair or is that too strong?
I think that's right. Although what's a little strange about it in some ways is you think a lot of, so for example, the strong vision of a unitary executive that this administration has adopted and tried to advance, which Jackson really uh, invented in lots of ways, and the Jackson administration was advancing it. But Jackson was doing it in order to serve a larger substantive vision and fight other fights, right? So it's an instrumental vision about I need to grab hold of the executive power and the executive office, and I need to use it in particular ways in order to accomplish something in particular. And with the Trump administration, it's often less clear what the point is, except just that I want to control this thing. Um, and so, again, we would normally think about this is part of the instrumental moves that a reconstructive president makes in order to consolidate power, in order to be able to do other substantive things. And it's a little less clear what the other substantive things are. Although, I think there are hints there. I mean, among them are on the immigration front, the pulling back from globalization front. And it may be that when all is said and done and we look back at the Trump administration, it's that we have transformed ourselves in significant ways into being a much less globalist country than we were previously. Maybe that's true on the foreign policy side as well. We will find ourselves to be less positioned as a kind of superpower the way we had been in the post-war era, and that's sort of the substantive vision that sort of emerges out of this, and we start looking back on saying, well, a lot of these instrumental moves were in the service of some of that. But it's, again, not yet clear. I think we're seeing mostly the instrumental part, and
Yeah.
it's a little less clear what the substantive part is.
So how about Trump's relationship with the court? The Supreme Court seems different than the other Reconstructive presidents. Certainly FDR. FDR faced a court that was basically against his agenda
Yeah,
and, and early on kind of striking it down. And uh, the Trump administration's departmentalist energies have been focused on the lower federal courts, but
yeah.
towards the Supreme Court, it's been extremely accommodating, deferential, respectful. So just comment on that and what that means for these sets of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that the administration has not yet radically departed from constitutional rules that the court thinks are correct and important has tamped down some of the departmentalist energy we might otherwise expect from a president like this. I mean, again, I think the departmentalist arguments emerge as sort of an instrumental claim in order to accomplish other things. And if you don't need to trot out the departmentalist arguments, then why would you bother? And you might see that with the Trump administration, that if they get everything they want out of the U.S. Supreme Court, then why develop out an elaborate set of departmentalist arguments that are sort of picking fights that are unnecessary? Although this administration seems to be perfectly happy to pick fights that are unnecessary in all kinds of ways. Um, but I'm not convinced yet that we're not going to get to that moment. So I think there are substantive things the administration would like to do that I think the court will push back on or would push back on. So birthright citizenship, for example, I think if that executive order ever gets in front of the court squarely on the merits, Trump administration is likely to lose on that, and that would raise really interesting questions then about how Trump administration respond to that. I think a lot of these, so-called shadow dockets, sort of order, preliminary orders the court has adopted so far, that when those cases eventually get to the U.S. Supreme Court on the merits, it's not entirely obvious to me that the court will simply rubber stamp everything Trump has been doing. So there may be more tensions between the administration and the court at this point. And so on some basic unitary executive things, it's clear that the majority of the court is basically on the same page with the administration. You're not going to get a lot of conflict there, I don't think. Maybe Federal Reserve Board accepted.
Right.
But so I think it remains to be seen. We're still very early in this presidency, and I think it remains to be seen then what kinds of conflicts wind up emerging with the U.S. Supreme Court as well, and how far would Trump go if he finds himself really at odds with the U.S. Supreme Court in that sense. Um, and again, I think some of this is just a function. Again, we don't really know what the substantive goals are of this administration. The substantive vision of the Constitution is that is emerging here is not entirely clear. And it's also possible that they may wind up articulating a substantive vision of the Constitution that the Supreme Court regards as a significant departure from what we had before, but not one that's necessarily incompatible with the constitutional rules we had before. So it may break all kinds of norms. It may create a different set of ideals and aspirations and visions about the constitutional order, but they may be able to do it in ways that are kind of compatible. And so some of the post-liberal sort of theories about how the economy ought to be ordered, for example, you can imagine sort of developing that in ways that you look at it and say, well, that looks nothing like Reagan's America, but also think, but it doesn't actually violate any constitutional law the way the court understands it. On the other hand, if we go post-liberal directions and we're going to have a significant restructuring of free speech doctrine, um, uh, it's a different question then about what kinds of conflicts we're going to get between the court and the administration on that front.
So I predict this is not a shocking prediction, and I think you basically said this, that the administration is not going to win all of these cases on the merits. The Solicitor General has been very selective in the interim order cases he's brought to the court so far.
Yeah.
And I agree that they're likely going to prevail in the unitary executive and related cases. Things like the tariff, things like the Alien Enemies Act, things like birthright citizenship, these are going to be harder. One of the things I learned from your book, I guess I knew, but I deepened my learning, was that whether Trump is going to be departmentalist vis-a-vis the court depends on what the court does. Trump needs the court. I mean, there's a reason why he's paying fealty to the court. He wins and can solidify his gains when the court blesses what he does. So so I'm just wondering if there's anything we can say yet about how the court is thinking about this. I mean, is it and what does history tell us about how the court is thinking about this relationship? I don't know if you looked at the oral argument in Casa in one of the footnotes, but
Yeah.
there was back and forth about these very issues. Would the executive branch comply with the judicial decisions? It's clear the court is thinking, at least to some degree, strategically about these things. And I guess I don't think that Trump is going to defy the court. I think that Trump will lose before the court, but I think he'll win before the court too. And I think it's going to be in his administration's interest to continue playing ball with the court, so to speak. So I wonder what you think of that as a prediction. It's not an astounding prediction, but also more importantly, what how might the court, based on what you know from history, be thinking about this moment?
Yeah, so let me come back to the question of how strategic the court's thinking and how it might be thinking about it, just to highlight one other thing that's unusual about the Trump administration, if we think of it in these sort of reconstructive terms, and sets it up very differently relative to the court as a consequence. So one thing about reconstructive presidents in the past is, presidents may have reconstructive ambitions, but they often have to temper those ambitions because they don't have the political support to do it.
Right.
And one feature of the Trump administration that contrasts sharply with these other great presidents we were talking about is he doesn't have that kind of political support. So despite the fact that President Trump wants to say he had this landslide mandate never known to man before, he had nothing like the support that FDR, or Jackson, or Lincoln, or anyone else did relative to electoral victories, relative to congressional majorities. So he's working with a much thinner legislative majority, for example, than any of those prior presidents that we were talking about. It's
And
not
by the
clear he
way,
has, yeah,
and let me just say, in contrast to FDR, I'm sorry to interrupt, but he's
no.
program is almost all executive orders. It's not new legislation that, it has kind of a deeper roots and a longer life. So, I mean, I think, and that's part of this political dynamic you're talking about. But I'm sorry to
No, I
interrupt.
think that's right. And it's kind of remarkable. I mean, I have to assume that in part the administration has made the calculation they don't actually have the votes in Congress to be able to accomplish some of what they want to do. And so,
Why not? Why
um,
not get Congress? Why not get Congress to just bless what he's doing in tariff policy? He can't.
I assume that's right. Because
Impeachment.
otherwise, otherwise, if you care at all about the future, you would want to, and even if you cared about some of these court cases, and so the near-term future, you would want to get Congress to bless some of these things, which also suggests then this is may not be nearly as durable as what we would anticipate out of a reconstructed president, for example. He's not yet winning that larger political battle of bringing the country behind him, bringing congressional majorities behind him that will sort of solidify a new set of policy commitments that are going to be stable going forward. This all may be very transitory and temporary, which is not a feature of reconstructed presidents. But
Yeah.
this has consequences for the relationship between the president and the courts, then, right? Because part of what made presidents like FDR well situated to go into battle with the U.S. Supreme Court was he had massive majorities behind him. And so a lot of Republicans thought that FDR might actually lose at the end of his first term of office. They went after him hammer and tong in the 36 elections, arguing he's a dictator and you can't possibly give this guy a second term of office, which may sound familiar to some people about how you try to attack a president like that as they're moving into reelection. And it wasn't successful. The Republicans got trounced in that election. FDR gained congressional seats in that election. The court looked at that and said, we've lost on this issue. And moreover, not only was FDR vindicated by the voters at the polls, but his new congressional majority was so large he could have easily passed constitutional amendments if he wanted to. And Trump's just not in that situation. He's in a much more vulnerable situation, doesn't have that kind of support. And so if he wants to take on the court, he's in a weaker situation than FDR would have been, for example. On the other hand, it's also true that the court is not filled with public confidence either. And so the court is also in a relatively weak position because all of our institutions seem to be in a weak position these days. So it's not entirely obvious if you really had a conflict between Trump and the court, how exactly that would play out and who would be clearly victorious in that context. But it should presumably give the administration a little reluctance to want to have that fight. But it also should give the court some reluctance to have that fight, which it leads to the strategic question. I think the court would prefer not to have that fight if they can avoid it. And I think they're probably cognizant of the fact that one thing about Trump is he's unpredictable in this regard. He's willing to violate all kinds of norms in ways that other presidents might not. And so I don't think you can safely assume, if you're a justice, that the president would not defy a court order. And one thing we know from the history of the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court is very reluctant to be put into a situation in which a president might defy a judicial order. And so they would much prefer not to order presidents to do things if they're at all lacking in confidence. The president will actually do those things. And that may mean that this court will look for ways of avoiding issuing those kinds of orders as well, just because they don't know for sure what the Trump administration would do. And you don't really want to play chicken with the president if you're the Supreme Court.
All right, I think that's a great place to end. Thanks so much, Keith. I highly recommend your book, The Political Foundations of Judicial Supremacy, and thanks for chatting.
Thanks. Appreciate it.